welcome all of you to the SAIS China Forum. This is our last China Forum of the semester, and we have a very special program with two members of the SAIS community. I'm excited to tell you that we are going to hear a talk from Natalie Lichtenstein on her new book, A Comparative Guide to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This topic makes me feel a little bit old and dizzy because it seems like just a few years ago that we were all involved and caught up in the negotiations for China to become part of the WTO, and that this was such a great milestone in China's joining the real international community. And barely 15 years later, they had put the finishing touches on establishing the world's latest multilateral development bank. So that's just such an amazing transformation, or so it seems to me, that this is somewhat of a revolutionary development to see them leading the Belt and Road Initiative and getting all these countries to sign up for this new bank. So anyway, just a little reflection, and we have the privilege of hearing from someone who has a really unique perspective on the bank. Natalie Lichtenstein was the consultant and chief counsel for the establishment of AIIB, and then she was the inaugural general counsel to the bank, all over a period of 2 years in 2014 and 2016. She's well known to many of you here in the Washington community. She had a 30-year career at the World Bank. Beginning in 1980, she retired in 2010, and she did a number of different positions, held several senior roles there, but she was a specialist in institutional governance and reforms. And her last assignment, she was leading the work on relations to enhance participation of developing countries in the World Bank Group. So she was a very logical person for China to turn to when they needed someone to advise them on this new bank. And she brings a real insider's perspective to her book and to her talk today. We're also very pleased to claim her as a member of the SAIS community. For over 10 years, she's been teaching a course on Chinese law and society at SAIS, and has recently decided to work as a visiting scholar and remain with SAIS affiliation. We have a commentary tonight from Peter Botellier, and he's also well known to many of you and has also had an illustrious World Bank career. He has been a member of the SAIS community for 15 years, also as a professor teaching economics, both as an adjunct and then as a full-time member of the Faculty of China Studies. So he himself, we hope to invite you to hear him on his new book in the fall on Chinese economic policy making. And I know that he and Natalie worked together at the World Bank and have known each other for 25 years, so we are very lucky to have both of them here tonight. Let's begin by inviting Natalie to tell us about her book. Thank you.
Hello. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, in part because I have been part of the SAIS community for more than 10 years, and I've just benefited so much from the interaction, both with my students, some of whom I see out there, and my colleagues, that it's great to be able to be here. And I got a lot of support from all of them while I was working at AIB and also while I was working on this book. So that's also nice for me. So I thought I would start with a little bit of an overview and talk about, first, why might you be interested in AIB and why this book? So what is AIB? It is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. There are those who call it the AIIB, but I cannot get my tongue around that. So you're stuck with AIB as long as I'm doing the talking. It is a multilateral development bank that was set up to finance infrastructure for the development of Asia with about $100 billion in capital. It started operations in 2016. It now has 84 approved members from East Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, West Asia, Oceania, that's all regional, as well as Europe, Africa, Latin America, and North America. So what's a multilateral development bank? Some of you have worked in them forever, and some of you have never seen one before. It's an international organization that pools money, funding from member countries, and provides loans, guarantees, equity investments, and technical assistance for development projects, primarily in its members. So, for example, you might have heard of the World Bank, which was started in 1944, when there were about 44 countries at the negotiations, and now has 189 members and about $270 billion in capital in its sovereign arm in the IBRD. Or the Asian Development Bank, which was started in 1965 and now has 67 members and about $140 billion in capital. Since they're all busy asking for capital increases, the numbers are a little bit in flux, but basically AIB's $100 billion is a bit less than ADB's and a lot less than the World Bank's for the moment. So why have you heard about AIB? Well, the tagline in the media is China's answer to the World Bank. You remember that one? That's why you've heard about it. So why is that? So the origin story, in fact, is that China led the initiation of this bank among 22 developing countries in Asia. And according to the media, and some people you might talk to, the US, Japan, and many of their allies were initially concerned by the idea that there would be a multilateral development bank set up with neither the US nor Japan in the lead. And they were concerned about the governance and the environmental safeguards. But eventually, 35 other countries joined those first 22. And that was seen as a defiance of the US in some ways in favor of China. Rightly or wrongly, as I said, now that I've tried to read everything that I could about AIB, there are a lot of different stories about that, but be that as it may, 57, now 84 countries have joined, and the US and Japan have not yet. So in a sense, it's the first major Chinese-led international financial institution. And why will AIB matter? Well, in one sense, it'll matter if it finances and stimulates the financing of more and better infrastructure and development in Asia. But in another sense, it could be the harbinger of a new role for China in global governance, and that's another thing that many people are interested in. So what's special about this book, and what's my role? So I was invited to join the multilateral secretariat that was putting together and did all the technical work for the negotiations and the setup of AIB. That included drafting all the legal documents and sitting at the negotiations. So why me? Well, I spent 20 years at the World Bank as a lawyer working on projects in China. That alone, I think, would not have been useful, although it did make me grateful for the nonstop flights. But I spent the last 10 years, as it happened, at the World Bank as the chief institutional lawyer, the lawyer for the board. I worked on internal governance reforms, what should the powers be of different countries, who gets how many shares. So in a sense, I had a lot of the knowledge that goes into putting together a multilateral development bank. And the reason I think I need to emphasize that is because the one thing I had that everyone found very strange was a US passport, especially when the media discussions, at least, suggested that the U.S. was vehemently opposed to the AIB. Many people said, well, how can you do that? Why did they hire you to do this? And somehow just saying competence didn't seem to answer the question. So I would say my U.S. passport, as far as I know, was not particularly relevant and was certainly less of a hindrance than getting promoted in the World Bank, I'm sorry to tell you students. So when I was asked to do this, the best part of it for me was that I started calling lawyers around the world, or Skyping, or whatever we could figure out, and said, I'm going to draft this new charter. I have some general marching orders of what they have in mind. So tell me about your charter. What's wrong with it? What's right with it? What would you change? What have the problems been? And that was really, really interesting. Because not just the World Bank in Washington, but there's an Asian Development Bank in Manila, there's a European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London, there's the Inter-American Development Bank down the street, there's the African Development Bank, there's also the European Investment Bank, alphabet soup, but they all have charters that are pretty similar and they behave completely differently. So it was a really interesting experience to talk to people in all of these places. And then I discovered that many of them said, you remember that book that Mr. Shahada wrote? So Ibrahim Shahada was the general counsel of the World Bank for about 15 years, but wrote a lot and was well known, and wrote a book that compared all the charters of all the different development banks when the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development was founded in 1990. And so many people said to me, I had that book on my shelf, I used it all the time. So I thought, well, I've just finished going through that process. So maybe I should update it and expand it and write the same kind of book. So that's part of this book, which is comparing all of the other banks. But the purpose for it is beyond the other lawyers around the world. I saw how much confusion there was about AIB, in part because of the publicity around China, and people saying, well, why did they do this? And was this a Chinese idea? And you sort of think, well, gosh, could be, but there are 5 other banks that have exactly the same clause. So I thought it might be useful to the analysis in all the different fields that everybody wants to do, to have a book that would say what's the same and what's different. Then you can write your interesting articles and analyses about why it might have been different. So for me, it was really an opportunity to lay out what's the same and what's different. Now I want to talk a little bit about the substance of it, but I will try to stay out of the weeds. First, because it's all in the book, and second, because I'd need a blackboard and I'd need to draw diagrams and explain lots of things. So let's just talk first. I think lots of people are interested in the question of how did AIB come to be? And many people have their views on that. I'll tell you what I know, but there's a lot I don't know. Most stories say AIB was proposed by Chinese President Xi Jinping in October 2013 at an APEC meeting in Indonesia. And I've seen the speech, so I think that's true. But I discovered in doing the work for the book that actually it was a proposal around starting in about 2005. In the many different layers of discussions about the response to the financial crisis of the late 90s, there was a proposal for an Asian investment bank based on the European Investment Bank that had been discussed, but really hadn't gone anywhere. And there had been a Chinese proposal for an Asian infrastructure bank. So the proposal that was made in 2013 basically drew on all of those, but gave it an added push. So after that, the Chinese Ministry of Finance started multilateral consultations with lots of interested countries. And within a year, 22 countries had signed a memorandum of understanding in October of 2014. At that point, there were 22. But the their agreement was, here are the bases in which we want to establish a bank, and others can join in, but they just have to agree to the same principles. So the question was, well, when can others join in, and how? As it happened, they not only agreed on the terms of what they wanted the bank to look like, they agreed on a deadline. So in October of 2014, they wanted the negotiations to be completed and the charter, the treaty, to be signed in June, like 8 months, 7 months later. And they wanted the bank to be open and operating by the end of December 2015. So working back from that, once I was asked to help negotiate this, you sort of work backwards and say, if you want to sign a treaty at the end of June, you need to go through some government processes in almost every country. You better finish negotiations by the end of May. So in theory, you could say anybody who wants to join could come in at the end of May. But there are two problems with that. One is the financial basis of these institutions is shareholding. And so how much you put in affects how much everybody else puts in. You need to have some agreement on that. So it's kind of not a last-minute deal. The other thing is, if you've ever been in a negotiation with 20 to 50 people or a discussion, people don't usually come into discussions with having no ideas of their own and fully ready to accept everything that everybody else has negotiated. So leaving that to the last minute didn't seem really sensible. And it seemed like it would be much more sensible to have anybody who was going to be in the discussions to be in by April, so you could get everything done by May. So we set a deadline of March 31st, 2015 for countries to say they were interested. So that's why in March of 2015, the United Kingdom made news, because it became the first non-Asian, non-regional country to say it was going to join the discussions for AIB, which got a fairly negative response from somebody somewhere in the White House. And suddenly that was all over the papers as the UK is defying the US and coming in to join AIB. And then Switzerland came, and then Luxembourg came. And so suddenly, instead of having 22 countries and then 26 countries, you had 30 countries in March. And the UK and Switzerland and Luxembourg were at the March discussions. But on March 31st, we were in negotiations in Kazakhstan, in Almaty, and I guess notifications of other countries being interested were coming into people's cell phones. And generally not everybody turns their phones off when they come into meetings. So there was a moment in which you heard this ping, 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 ping all around the room as the notifications of another 19 countries or so came in. So in the end, there were 57, which is a lot of microphones. But we did finish negotiations. The charter was signed at the end of June, and it was effective Christmas Day, December 25th, 2015, when enough countries had signed up, and the bank opened for business in middle of January 2016. So pretty close to the schedule, at least for me. So why did those pings go off? Why did the countries join? Many different reasons, some of the ones you'll read. First, what was China's motivation in launching that proposal? Was it frustration with its role in the World Bank and the IMF and the Asian Development Bank? Was it China's view that infrastructure had been so key to its economic development that it was important for other countries? Was it the first sign of Chinese domination of global governance, as you will also read? I don't know the answers to that. I'm just saying that's some of the things you can see. It was obvious to me, having unfortunately been involved in work at the World Bank to change the voting alignment of different countries, that it's very difficult to do that because it's a zero-sum game. Nobody goes up unless somebody goes down. And it's very hard. Suppose China wanted to buy more shares of the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. They'd be happy to have the money, but you'd need to find some other member that was willing to lose some voting power. And so it's not such an easy thing to do, although apparently it's about to be done in the World Bank, or agreed the end of this week, if you believe what you read in the papers. So it wasn't surprising to me that the solution was not for China to put more money into the existing banks. It is a little surprising that the proposal was to set up a new bank, because much of the funding for different development causes in the last 25 years has not been through setting up a new institution. It's been through setting up a fund managed by one of the existing institutions with its own governance arrangements. So lots of very interesting fact patterns, makes lawyers happy, but not setting up a new institution. So in a way, this is kind of a retro move, but you know, these countries agreed to do it. There was another retro move going on at the same time. That's the BRICS Bank, which is formerly known as the New Development Bank, and that is a similar development bank, but it's equally owned by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and it's located in Shanghai and is not the AIIB. I originally thought that it was, and I was going to get to work in Shanghai, but you know, Beijing was okay. Anyway, enough of the establishment process and the motivations. Let me tell you a little bit about the architecture, you know, kind of what it is, what it does, and what's different. There's a lot more in the book, and either you or your libraries will buy it and you'll be able to read about it. So, well, what does AIIB do? What's its mandate? What's its purpose? It's supposed to foster sustainable development, create wealth, and improve infrastructure connectivity in Asia by investing in infrastructure and other productive sectors, as well as promoting regional cooperation and partnership. That's a lot more succinct than the purposes of the World Bank, which take about half a page, in which you can find anything for any legal opinion. It's quite wonderful. And it's a little bit longer than many of the other, the regional MDBs that just say promote regional economic or regional economic development. Sometimes they've added sustainable. But it's not restricted to financing only in developing or regional members, and some of the other ones are. And it's not limited to public sector operations, which the World Bank is. Most of the other banks since then have included private sector operations as well as public sector operations in the same bank. The World Bank, for example, has a separate international organization, the International Finance Corporation, that you may know, which does the private sector non-government guarantee work. So that's, you can see if you look at these banks over the last 70 years, there's been some evolution. AIB is not the first bank to combine all of these functions, but it combines them in a particular way. So when it makes loans, guarantees, takes equity, it's bound by a set of operational policies and procedures. And that was one of the things that one could see in the concerns that were voiced publicly while AIB was being negotiated. Would it have the same environmental and social standards? Would it have the same anti-corruption policies? Would it have the same financial requirements? Or would it have lesser requirements than the other multilateral development banks, and therefore make it more difficult for those banks to do their business? And would all the projects go to this lowest common denominator? Well, as it happens, what they ended up with for AIB is broadly comparable to the other development banks. It was an opportunity to update some things, and they're not entirely identical, but sound banking principles, environmental, social, procurement, transparency, they're all there. There are a few areas in which there's a theme of flexibility or adaptability in the AIB charter, where the bank can do new things or different things without having to interpret the charter to say this fits. So, for example, most of the charters say you can have loans, guarantees, and invest in equity if it happens that you have that, and technical assistance. But rather than having to say, well, there's this new financial product, and if we include the following 15 features, it'll look like a loan, and therefore we can call it a loan, and it'll be okay under the charter. AIB has a provision that allows them to have new types of financings decided by the Board of Governors. So the idea is to say, don't worry about whether you can call it a loan. Is it a good thing to do? Is it good for the bank? Is it good for the recipient? If it's a good thing to do, then get the right approvals and justify it and do it the right way. Don't do it in a way where you can twist it to fit in the articles. That might never get used, but it's a way in which AIB is different. It's different in the sense that it's not limited to lending to non-regional members or financing projects for non-regional members. Most of the other regional development banks, the Asian Development Bank is supposed to lend for the development of Asia, African Bank for Africa. IBRD doesn't have regions, so they don't have this issue. So, in fact, the idea is that the projects have to benefit the economic development of Asia and fit the purposes and functions of AIB, but they could have a project in a non-regional country. And the Board of Directors has recently agreed with a strategy that says non-regional projects have to either support trade and connectivity with Asia, finance global public goods, specifically renewable energy, or are investments in non-regional members which are geographically proximate and economically closely integrated. So in fact, the first non-regional project, which predated the strategy, was a series of 11 private sector solar investments in Egypt, which was co-financed with IFC. So just to illustrate why some of the same and the different. I think if you've read anything, the one thing that people comment about the most as being different is in the governance structure. The basic governance structure is, again, quite similar. Board of Governors, every country has a governor. Board of Directors, elected by groups of countries to represent them in the sort of general oversight of the bank, and the president. The governors of AIB have a few additional powers, as I've said, to expand, to be flexible. The Board of Directors is non-resident. If that wouldn't be surprising if you were talking about private companies, but the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks I've mentioned all have resident boards, which means the World Bank board is resident in Washington. There's something like 300 people and costs associated with the 25 directors, 25 alternate directors, and a number of advisors, senior advisors, and technical assistants. I know they've changed the titles, but they all had those before. Having a non-resident board is not a new idea. The European Investment Bank has had one since the late 1950s. EFAD has one, CAF has one. There are quite a few multilateral financial institutions that do. But I think it's meant that instead of thinking that the board was going to exercise its oversight by being in the headquarters, it's meant focusing a little bit more on, well, what should the board's role be? And so there are some more explicit provisions in the AIB Charter about the powers of the board, its ability, its oversight mechanism, and its responsibility for regular supervision of the bank's operations. So I can talk about that a little bit more later, but I think if you read one article, that's what they'll talk about. The other thing they'll talk about is the voting. Most of these institutions, the voting power is, well, all of these institutions, the voting power is weighted. That means it's not one country, one vote. It's weighted primarily by how much money they've put in the form of shareholding. There's some other complements to the shareholding votes, which are nice and technical, but basically, if you look broadly, about 85% of AIB voting power is determined by shareholding. about 95% of World Bank voting power is determined by shareholding, and about 80% of Asian Development Bank voting power is dependent on shareholding. The others, it's pretty close to 99% or 100% is dependent on shareholding. So AIB is somewhere a little bit, more room for smaller shareholders to have a bigger voice, but not as much as the ADB and more than the World Bank. The other piece about voting power that you will see is that there are a number of special majority decisions that require a specific percentage of voting power in order for them to be affirmed. So in AIB, the highest voting power is 75%. That happens to be the highest percentage in most of the regional development banks as well. And there is a complicated but useful chart in my book that you can look at if you really want to see that. But China at this point has about 26% of the voting power. So China has a veto of any of those decisions that require 75%. And the other place you'll hear about veto is in the World Bank, where 85% is the majority for one decision only, actually, which is amending the charter. And the U.S. voting power stays at about, at the moment, 16 to 17%. So the U.S. has a veto on that. There are about 10 similar decisions in the IMF, but I don't pretend to understand those. So just to say quickly what's happened in the first 2 years, AIB's approved 26 projects for slightly up to, I should say, 4.5 billion. About 2/3 of those they co-financed along with these other MDBs, which suggests that their policies and procedures were compatible with them, both public sector, private sector. They have about 84 approved members, and they have a AAA rating, and I read in the papers we'll probably have a borrowing this year. So I just want to say a quick word about the future. I don't know. I stopped working there in summer of 2016. But I think that AIB continues to follow what I would call the multilateral playbook. And I think there are a lot of incentives to keep doing that, at least for a while, both for China and for the other shareholders. Because without the credibility of good projects and decent financial returns, the markets and the media will view AIB very critically, and that will reflect badly on China and President Xi much more than the other shareholders. It's not to say that there won't be problem projects and problem loans. There have to be, as sure as the night follows day. It's more how they handle them that will be telling, and I'm happy I got the book out before there were any. Thank you.
Just a note that we'll have some commentary, and then we will open up to questions as always, and we hope that you'll all stay and join us for a reception a little before 7, probably. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine. I hear that my mic is on. I didn't do anything, so somebody must be centrally controlling that. I'd like to start by congratulating you, Natalie, on writing this book. It's a very specialized type of subject, and unless you write it at the beginning, when this knowledge is still fresh in your mind, it never gets written. This is a major multilateral financing initiative that China took, I believe, in 2013, even though the history may go back to 2005, as you mentioned. So to have had a hand in creating that institution and then writing a book about it is a major accomplishment. I'd like to start my comments by raising the question whether the US decision to stay out of AIIB was the right decision. You may recall that, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, that when the US was approached, the reactions from the White House were very negative. Surprised many people. We still don't know who were really the people advising against this. But in any event, the US stayed out of it, in spite of the fact that the president-designate, Chin Li-chun, and I have some comments on that also, traveled to the US at least twice, personally inviting the US to join as a founding member. He was totally ignored. My understanding is that the reasons for the US decision to stay out of the AIIB were fear that this would be a murky Chinese institution, lack of transparency, that it would be an instrument in the hands of politicians in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that it would compete with the World Bank, where the US government has a very important role to play, that it would not be serious about environmental standards or social standards or the resettlement of people that might have to move to other areas because of the infrastructure development. None of these concerns, from the little I know, seem to have materialized. In fact, almost the opposite seems to be happening. Based on your remarks and my very limited knowledge from other sources, AIIB in Beijing is shaping up like a genuine, high-quality, multilateral institution. And the US would have had an opportunity to collaborate with China on a very important project, didn't do it, it missed the opportunity, it missed the boat. I personally regret very much that the US decided to stay out of it, but maybe we can have some further discussion on that later on. If you are wondering why there is so much bad blood in the bilateral relationship between China and the US at this present time, just remember this is just one nail in the coffin of that relationship. It's hyperbolic, but so I personally regret the US stayed out of it. There were rumors at the time that the US decided not only to stay out of it, but also that the US government lobbied allies to stay out of it as well. But there seems to be some doubt about the veracity of these rumors. If you can tell us what really happened, I would welcome that. My second comment is on the leadership of that new bank. I have personally known Chin Li-chun, who is the president of the institution, since the early 90s, since 92, when he was alternate director on the board of the World Bank, based here in Washington. The guy has a fantastic career. I can think of very few international civil servants who are better qualified to lead a new multilateral institution than he is. He not only has his World Bank experience and the Chinese government experience behind him, he also served as the executive vice president for Kuroda, as deputy of the Asian Development Bank in Manila for several years, before he went back to China to become chairman of the largest sovereign wealth fund, the China Investment Corporation, and later on the China Investment, the CICC, I can't remember what it stands for. So it has enormous relevant experience at the national level, at the international level, perfectly fluent in English. The guy is overqualified, if anything, for that job. And I think to find people of that caliber to run an institution like this is not easy. The Chinese have done it, and I congratulate them. Now, my third comment is on you, Natalie, and allow me to cite from Chin Li-chun's foreword in your own book. Chin Li-chun, as I mentioned, is the president of the AIIB, and he writes here, Ms. Liechtenstein's role cannot be overstated. She was the linchpin and realist who translated the chief negotiator's vision into a pragmatic and well-defined legal framework that became the foundation of AIIB. She was exceptionally resourceful and always ready to take out a legal phrase from her toolkit to work out a disputed provision, thereby bridging gaps in understanding. Her deep expertise, wise counsel, and diligence won the respect of all, generously expressed by the chief negotiators and secretariat staff. This book, for which he wrote the foreword, is a testament to her contributions. AIIB will forever bear her fingerprints. Let me just follow up with some further comments on this institution and why I believe that there is no basis for the US concerns about the low quality and non-transparency in this institution. According to your book, and all the knowledge that I have, most of it is from this book, the AIIB has adopted the English language as its working language. Jindy Chun has appointed 5 vice presidents, none of whom are Chinese. They have adopted the US dollar as the standard unit of account for their own accounts and for their loans. They have adopted the general accepted accounting practices, the US accounting standard for corporations. What else can you do to become transparent and to convince the international community that this is a serious institution, following transparent standards and taking environmental concerns very seriously? I didn't mention that Jindy Chun has repeatedly stated that they have very high and very precise environmental standards. They have essentially adopted the World Bank standards, which are amongst the most stringent in the world. Abusing the opportunity of my commentatorship, allow me to ask you a few questions, Natalie. I mentioned that the US dollar is the unit of account in AIIB. That surprised me, because when the AIIB was established, discussions between China and the IMF on including the renminbi in the IMF basic unit of account, the special drawing right, were already going on. This would have been a wonderful opportunity of China to adopt its own currency as the standard of account for this new bank. They're putting in most of the money anyway. Many of the loans will be used to purchase in China. So why haven't the Chinese used the renminbi as the standard currency for this institution?
Okay, shall I answer that? You have a few more.
I have a few more questions,
okay.
But why don't you pick this?
On the last question first, on the US dollar as the unit of account, I don't know what the actual motivations were, but I do know that, for example, the BRICS Bank also has the US dollar as the unit of account. And I think some of it has to do with what do you expect your transactions to be? What do your borrowers need? What are the markets going to look for? I did discover when looking at the other multilateral development banks, which were established at a very different time in the financial markets. So Bretton Woods institutions have gold or US dollars, the July 1, 1944 gold dollar, and however you choose to interpret it after that. And all of the other banks basically take the same standard, even where the US was not a member. So I think it's probably more tied to the actual functioning and credibility of the institution rather than to China, but I don't know.
Okay.
That was...
Well, this struck me as surprising, a very interesting choice, because they were pushing the renminbi as an international currency since 2009. Here they had a wonderful opportunity to make that visible, and they avoided doing it. My second question concerns the links between, if any, the AIIB and the Chinese or President Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, which you mentioned. I was struck by the fact that in the 24 projects that you mentioned, that are included in your book, you mentioned there are now 26. 24 are in a table here. None of them seem to be BRI-type projects. All of them are different, unless I made a mistake and don't know the facts. Why, if China wanted to use the AIIB as an instrument for its priority projects, which is the BRI, why does the AIIB not pick BRI projects, but all the 24 listed in your book seem to be different projects?
Well,
And related to that, if I may, another question. China created a special fund to help support and finance the Belt and Road Initiative projects. They created, from foreign exchange reserves, something they called the Silk Road Fund, which I believe is managed by a special unit in the central bank. It must have occurred to them that they could use that money also to give it to AIIB as a special fund under their control. The fact that they didn't do that, to me, suggests, again, that China was anxious to establish a genuine multilateral institution and not a policy instrument for the Chinese state. These are the two questions, BRI-AIIB relations.
so when I started working on AIB, I had heard of something called One Belt, One Road, but I didn't really know what it was, and it didn't come up in the discussions. Now it's been rebranded as the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, which is I guess as the Chinese would say, is their proposal, but many countries have joined in a former Silk Road and maritime Silk Road and land Silk Road of countries, essentially along China's periphery, but going much broader. At this point, I think there are a number of think tanks, as well as centers all over the world that have BRI in their name and are doing analyses of all of AIB's projects. And I think that by and large, the countries that are included are countries in the initiative, but I haven't looked. So there's no formal linkage. And I think if you wanted to see where the projects fit in a BRI sense, there are plenty of articles and people out there looking at that. The Silk Road Fund, I do believe, is under PBOC, and I think that was established before AIB was. But AIB could easily take a special fund, like a trust fund or another kind of fund, and manage it if that's what the Chinese sought to do. I want to come back, though, to the question you asked at the beginning about the U.S. decision and the U.S. concerns about not coming into the negotiations. I don't believe the U.S. would have been able to join AIB, not because of the Chinese or any of the other 57 members. It's a treaty and it requires money. You need congressional action for both of those. In 2013, 14, and 15, the U.S. government couldn't even get the IMF amendments from 2010, 2011 approved in Congress for whatever reasons until December of 2015. So the idea that at that point in time you could have gotten congressional action, which is a necessary piece of this, to join, I think, it never occurred to me that the U.S. could join. But there is a difference between not joining and lobbying your allies not to join or voicing your concerns. And I've certainly read articles that have suggested that the United States did lobby other countries. I also have President Obama's remarks from the Rose Garden of April 28, 2015 that say, let me be very clear and dispel this notion that we were opposed or are opposed to other countries participating in the Asia Infrastructure Bank. That is simply not true. So I say, I'm sure there'll be many more articles about that. I don't actually know what happened because I wasn't part of that. But I will say that if you looked at it from the U.S. strategic interest, it's open procurement. So if the U.S. interest in U.S. suppliers and contractors bidding for AIB finance projects is paramount, you don't need to join AIB for that. The only reason to join was to have had a seat at the table for discussing the policy and the governance structure, and I don't think the US had the ability to do that. So it would be nice for AIB, and it would probably be good for US-China relations, but beats me, I can't speculate on that. If the US were to join, but I don't think it is any likelier today than it was in 2013 or 2014 that you would get congressional action on this. In fact, I think it is less likely. I think the really interesting question for AIB's next couple of years is Japan. I think this is very much an Asian institution, and to me, I would expect at some point Japan would want to join. And the question becomes shareholding. The concerns that I've seen in the press voiced by Japan are AIB's governance structure and its financing decisions on financing projects. We've already discussed that basically the financial and economic and environmental standards for projects are quite similar. And I was puzzled for a while about what Japan was concerned about in terms of governance. I know there's a non-resident board, because most of those provisions I copied from the Asian Development Bank Charter, and Japan seems to control that one pretty happily. And then I realized it was largely about the percentages. And so China having a veto, I think, is probably something that Japan would be concerned about. If Japan were to come into AIIB, the rule is agreed by the negotiators and publicly, is that your size of your shareholding should be your basic weight in the regional economy, in the case of a regional country, as measured by GDP. So Japan would have a pretty large share. They might not have to take all of it. And if they wanted to, China could then go down below 25%. I think they'd be ready to do that, but that's this minute. I don't know what it'll look like when Japan someday decides. But that's not really the only issue, because there are 50-something other countries. So what do the Europeans think? Probably they would be happy to have Japan in and would not mind, for example, Germany put in $4 billion and has 4% of the vote. So do they want to go down to $3 billion in order to make room for Japan? So it is a multilateral institution. It isn't just a Chinese institution. And so in that sense, I think it will be a very interesting story. But I don't know where that one will come out. And on Jin Lichun and the leadership and his very nice comments about me, it's very hard for me because, I mostly was a lawyer in this town where you only really want your lawyer out. If your lawyer is out in front, you're in trouble, as we see. So it was very hard for me to think that taking a high profile was good for the institution, but sometimes it is. So let me leave it at that. Yeah.
We have a couple of student volunteers with a microphone today. Yes, we do. Okay, just please identify yourself when I call, and keep your questions short so we have room. And let me mention that we will have books for sale and after the event. So, Professor Lardy.
Natalie, I recall Jin Lichun saying that in terms of hiring, it can be from any nationality, except for the vice presidents have to come from a country that's a member. Is that the way it still stands, or has it evolved since then? And how international is the staff?
So I think what the articles say are the vice presidents are selected through an open merit-based and transparent process, nominated by the president and appointed by the board. I don't think there's anything that says they have to come from a member country. But I think politically it would be very difficult if they didn't. There's a long tradition in all of these institutions of member countries jockeying for their nationals to have senior positions. For all of them, the articles say what many of the others do, which is subject to the technical competence, staff should be recruited from as wide a geographical basis as possible. In the case of AIB, it says as wide a regional geographic basis as possible, same language as ADB. I think first the staff is really lean, as Jinli Chun likes to say. And I think when I was there last month, somebody told me there were about 150 full-time staff and about 25% Chinese. If one, and a mix of other nationalities. Obviously, I was a great talking point because I hail from a non-member country. And I was appointed as general counsel to start with. So I think I was always a good example of merit-based selection. At least it's easy for me to say that, but I can't imagine any other reason they would have hired me.
Can I add one comment to this? Even if Mr. Lardy is right and the vice presidencies are limited to member countries, that's not a huge restriction. There are already 84 member countries, and they expect to go up to 100 by the end of next year. So you have ample choice still. I would like to add that for SAIS grads, this is a wonderful opportunity. You don't have to be Chinese speaking, you have to speak good English. So I'm not saying Chinese SAIS grads, but SAIS grads. Beijing is a pretty nice place to live. I've lived there for almost 5 years. It's not a bad thing to think about AIB as a potential employer.
Very good advice. Let's take a question at the back here.
Thank you, Natalie. Richard Jordan from NGOs at the UN. In 2016 and 2017, there were 2 infrastructure investment forums that brought together at the spring meetings all of the directors of all of the multilateral development banks. Do you know if those were held simply to say to the AIB, look, you're among equals and welcome to the quote-unquote club? Do you know anything about those forums? Thank you.
As far as I know, there are a number of multilateral development bank MDB fora. So there's the heads of MDBs that meet, I think, probably both spring and fall meetings and have done so for many years. There's also either MDB or International Financial Institution, IFI. The corporate secretaries meet, the environmental people meet, the anti-corruption people meet, the lawyers even meet, and I've sent them a link to the book. So I don't think there was any particular AIB agenda, but it could have gone right by me. But they do have the meetings pretty regularly.
A student back here in the blue.
Hi, my name is Fred Ponggui. I'm a second-year American Foreign Policy and China Studies concentrator here at SAIS. And I have a question regarding the voting power. And because there are now more and more non-regional members in the AIB, a lot of members country from Europe. So do you think there's a possibility of the adjustment of the voting power in between non-regional member and regional member? Because currently it's 25% and 75%. But I read news reports saying it is possibly to be 30% and 70%. And as you're the people who wrote the agreement, so I want to ask you on your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. So the AIB charter says that the regional shareholding should be 75% or such other amount as the Board of Governors may decide. And those of you who are lawyers can imagine that I would have told the people who proposed that that could means it could also go down to 0. So did you have that in mind? So the negotiators report says something about 70% being an important figure for the regional character of the institution. So there is flexibility around the 75%, but it's also not very quick that you can change the shareholding because you have to do it through some people buying more shares and some people not buying more shares. So just for comparison, the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank have about 60% regional. The Inter-American Bank regional is about 80, but regional developing countries is 50.05, and the US has 30% and Canada has 4%. And the EBRD, I think it's 50% European, and there's an interesting definition of what that includes. So they all have, for various reasons, come to this relationship. But, you know, I think one of the reasons they wanted some flexibility was if the U.S. did come in, it would be very hard, even if the U.S. took a small share, to fit the U.S. in and not expand the non-regional shareholding. That may not happen, and it may happen for different reasons. So there is some flexibility there. Good question, thanks.
Right here.
Can I make one supplementary comment here? If it is possible for the US to go back on TPP, surely they can go back on AIIB.
Well, Marty can probably tell us.
Yeah, thank you. Marty Weiss with the Congressional Research Service. And I mean, I can't reiterate your point. And just a quick comment and a question. Your statement about, you know, the U.S. Even if you got the 2/3 votes for advising consent, I can't. It would be very difficult to make the case that the U.S. should authorize and appropriate money to a MDB where it is not the largest shareholder, or the co-largest shareholder in the case of the ADB. I think it would be politically very difficult for members to kind of make that case to their constituents that it's worth the money. I think my question though is kind of having had this really awesome, incredibly awesome opportunity to start from scratch and creating, you know, not having the baggage of 70 years, in the case of the World Bank, of accumulated of issues. Now that this institution is created and is running, what areas of reform do you think are ripest and most realistic to kind of have some feedback loops to the existing MDBs, or I mean the core MDBs? What types of reforms do you think we might see in the next couple of years at the governance structures at the World Bank or any other banks?
I mean, might see, I think the answer is zero. But what might be interesting from AIB? Because I do think that the existence of a new institution at some level has had some impact, pressure, et cetera, on the others. I don't think anybody else is going to amend their charters to have a non-resident board. Although actually, when I went back to look at the histories, Asian Bank, African Bank, EBRD all had discussions about having a non-resident board. There was a big debate at Bretton Woods about whether the IBRD and the IMF should have a non-resident board, and no less a personage than John Maynard Keynes was in favor of a non-resident board. So it's not a crazy idea. But I don't think you'd have to do, for World Bank and others, you have to do a lot of amendments to do that. I think that's difficult. I think the project approval process is broken in all of them. I mean, the fig leaf that the board of directors sitting in Manila or Washington or now Abidjan approves every project, or London, they don't. They have, whether they call it streamlined procedure or no absence of objection, it basically goes through on paper. So why not set the parameters of a delegation? They're all good lawyers. They can find a way to do it. And it's too late in the process. If you're a developing country and you have a project and it takes 18 months, let's say, to get from when you think you want to do it to when it's fully done, and then your approval comes at the end, what happens if the World Bank board says no? It doesn't make sense in terms of the use of resources and what the members are going to get. And I think you will actually speed up the process, not because you'll be cutting corners, because you shouldn't be, but because you'll be able to do away with some of the excessive paperwork. So I think something like that is not very hard to do. I think lots of the other things that you might change are very hard to do because they're vested interests in everything. And actually, you know, the last thing I did at the World Bank was to work on governance and voice reform that ended up with the 2010 sort of shareholding reforms. AIB was far less contentious and painful than the experience I went through. And it's not just because there were 189 or 25 and 57 on the other side. I just think when you have something to lose, every country's got a vested interest. They've got a, you know, the directors would say, we would be happy for our voting power to go down, but not less than my neighbor, because then I won't get the chair, and I'll have to explain to my parliament in order to get funds for the soft loan window for IDA. So it becomes very difficult to change things. it's a little easier to go back to your authorities and say we didn't get everything than to say we lost something.
Saw some right here.
Thank you so much, Professor Natalie. I'm Feng Xing from China Daily. I have two questions. The first one is from the perspective of India. India has been, on the one hand, been the biggest beneficiary from this investment initiative, the IIB FT reports. And on the other hand, but it has been so reluctant to join the Belt and Road Forum last year, or the year before last year, I forgot, sorry. But how would you explain India's ambivalence in these two initiatives? And the second one is about the investment operation of this AIIB. Much of it goes to the infrastructure, but in the meantime, it has raised a lot of the concerns, which is very similar to the concern raised by Belt and Road Initiative. And how would you explain that? And is there some countries which are really taking this this initiative so seriously, and what is the concern behind it? Thank you.
So on your first question, yes, India is both the second largest shareholder at a little under 8% at this point, and they also are the largest recipient at this moment of AIB projects. How that affects their views on the Belt and Road Initiative, I don't know. And on the other question about the comments about investment operations and BRI, the critiques I've seen so far of AIB operations, and I expect there will be more, it would be normal, have been complaints about projects that AIB has co-financed with the World Bank, which is to say, the same project, AIB puts in 200 million, World Bank puts in 300 million, something like that. So the projects where I've read about complaints, and they've been on environmental and social grounds, have been projects that the World Bank was financing. So that doesn't mean there isn't a problem. That means if you were worried about having the best practice standards, you've got them and you still have a problem.
We're going to, please keep your questions short so we have time for about two more. Back in.
Hello, my name's Leah. I'm a recent graduate and I work for the federal government. My question is regarding I believe it's the first project that was actually constructed, which is the Beijing Clean Air project. I was wondering if you could speak to the decision to actually have this project when initially Gene promised that there would be no projects happening in China, and how he walked that back, and what the thought process was on that, and if you anticipate any other promises that have been previously made, like BRI or something like that, being walked back in the future potentially.
So I stopped working at AIB in the summer of 2016. The project you just mentioned, the Beijing Clean Air project, I believe was approved in December of 2017. So it's one of the most recent projects, not the first project. I would be surprised if it's already started construction, but that's great if it has. I don't know anything about that. I think what I have seen is the suggestion that because of AIB's focus under its energy strategy on clean air and on supporting countries in their Paris commitments, that was why they felt it was important to do this. But I don't know. And in terms of, so if that's a broken promise, maybe. I don't know who made the promise.
We have a question right here. Oh, well, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Hong. I'm from George Mason University, a PhD student there. You just mentioned that very important the problem issue with World Bank is that's weighed down by a lengthy process. So I wonder how attractive or how competitive is AIIB in that regard compared to both World Bank and ADB, which is a more immediate competitor. Thank you.
So I do think that the process so far has been much quicker and more efficient at AIB, but I think all of the other banks started small too. I did hear somebody at a presentation in Washington not long ago say, well, we'll have the ADB approve all of their infrastructure projects in 9 months, and then there'll be no need for the AIB. So clearly, there is a perception of how fast projects. But, you know, it's not, if you're going to do large infrastructure projects, those are going to take a long time no matter where you do them. But I think if you're quick in, it's the decision-making at the stages in between. It's a lot easier to do that when you have fewer layers, 150 staff versus 10,000. But you can't have too few layers because you also need to make proper assessments and proper decisions.
All right, do we have a last question? Right back here.
Hi there, my name is Michael Sutherland. I'm a China Studies concentrator here at SAIS, and I have two very quick questions. First, you mentioned the procurement process is open. Does that include state-owned enterprises? Are they eligible to bid in the procurement process? And second, please correct me if I'm wrong, it's my understanding that the AIIB allows non-sovereign entities to apply for membership as long as they're based in a member country. Could Chinese state-owned enterprises apply for membership and influence AIIB policy through that avenue?
So procurement process is open to entities in any member country, and it doesn't matter what their ownership structure is. So I believe lots of Chinese SOEs succeed very well in World Bank procurement. And most of the MDBs they've all recently, in fact, revised their procurement policies. So I think they would be able to bid. It depends there are rules for what you have to look at, but it's the same rules. The provision, so membership in the AIB is open to members of IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is the hard loan arm of the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. You must be a member of one or the other in order to apply for membership. The only members of IBRD are countries, and in order to be an IBRD member, you have to be an IMF member. The Asian Development Bank has a provision that allows what were essentially former colonies, which were associate members of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, to apply for membership. So there are also nation states in a sense. Macau is not a member of ADB, but they are a SCAP member. Hong Kong, Cook Islands. A number of countries use that provision in the ADB before they became sovereign states. So those are the countries that could become non-sovereign entities. Private sector, state-owned enterprise cannot apply. They cannot be members of ADB, and they certainly can't be members of IBRD. There are 3 entities that were members of the ADB that are not members of IBRD. One is the Cook Islands, one is Hong Kong, China, and the other is Taipei, No Space, China. The Cook Islands and Hong Kong have already been approved for membership in AIIB, and Hong Kong's already joined. As far as I know, Taipei, No Space, China, which is its ADB name, has not yet formally applied to AIIB, and given what I read about cross-strait relations, I don't think that will happen immediately, but the process is there when everybody's ready, and Macau would have to first join ADB, and then they could apply to join AIIB.
Do we have any closing comments from our speakers?
The one thing I do want to say, just your nice comments about Jin Li Chun, who I think will be speaking here this week. You know, while it's very nice that he said all those things that you read about me, I think it's very unusual to find a Chinese official of his generation who I believe reads the New Yorker and Le Monde on the weekends.
And who is an expert on Shakespeare.
Right. But, you know, I saw a number of World Bank presidents from the point of view of being the in-house lawyer, and, you know, they're very tough jobs. no matter how wonderful the individual is. So you just have to wish them well.
Please join me in thanking Professor Batelier and Professor Lichtenstein. Very good discussion.